The resumption of school after the holidays here is also leading to concerns about a further spread of the virus. Starting yesterday, students resumed in-person learning in many school districts. New York City, for example, reopened and resisted efforts by some parents to return to virtual learning. Face masks are compulsory, and some schools are planning to ramp up tests among students and staff. But teaching unions want officials in many states to utilise distance learning while the latest wave is at its peak. And some schools, including several in the Washington, D.C. area, have already switched to remote learning. Here in the nation's capital, in-person teaching will resume on Thursday. That's a delay, allowing the city to secure negative test results from every student and teacher before they return to the classroom. States like Massachusetts and New York have rejected the request from teaching unions for remote learning.
What was happening behind the scene to get these schools open is really amazing. It's commendable of the city and their focus. We're gonna pivot. We're gonna shift. We're gonna adjust. We're gonna get it done. That's the bottom line. And we're gonna get these schools open, and our children are going to be safe. Yes.
As kids in New York City return to school, parents have voiced concerns about the safety of being in the classrooms again, especially after a New Year's weekend and a massive surge in pediatric hospitalizations.
Honestly, it's a little, what's the word? It's a little too early to say just because we just came back from break. So it's like, give it a couple more days before we can see, just due to the variant being out and everyone's still getting sick over the holidays.
So Omicron, again, is less virulent or dangerous than prior strains. And most children that get Omicron have no or mild symptoms. Rarely, children can progress to severe disease. It's rare, but it can happen. About 2% of the COVID hospitalizations in the United States are in children. So, it is very upsetting as a pediatric infectious disease doctor to see children in the hospital with COVID.
Last year, the school disruptions left many parents scrambling to find childcare. This scare has added to a broadening sense of chaos in the first few days of this year as well. Although the Omicron variant appears to be far more contagious than previous iterations, data also suggests it may be less virulent than the Delta variant that preceded it. In New York, there are many parents who have supported the full reopening of schools and believe that schools are a safe space for children.
Just test more frequent, that's all. Just have the students, just test the whole building, the staff. Even if it takes 3 days just to go through the whole building, that's about it.
Yeah, I've been very supportive of the measures that schools have taken to try and remain in-person school instruction for children because it is essential to the overall well-being of children. And the strategies such as rapid testing and mask wearing and symptom check will keep schools as safe spaces.
So live to WION's correspondent Susan Tehrani, who joins us again today from New York City. Susan, there were reports yesterday that as schools in Manhattan reopened, because of COVID-19 infections, there were so few teachers that in some parts of the city, the kids were all having to group together in the school gymnasium because there simply weren't enough teaching staff to hold in-person classes. What are you hearing from schools in New York, and what are you hearing from parents about whether this was all a good idea?
Right, Simon, like anything in the United States these days, a really polarized environment when it comes to the opening of schools in New York and elsewhere. But regarding New York City, one question that many are asking is whether or not parents and teachers are prepared for remote learning and not so much whether or not school closures. And the reason for that is because they were so caught off guard last time for childcare and having to really mitigate that with their employment situation and whatnot. And so that's one aspect of it. And another aspect of it is this sort of tug of war between teachers' unions and the government, and how teachers really prefer not to come to school because, you know, they do have that sort of backing of the unions on the one hand, and that cushion. But on the other hand, parents and students really don't have that. And then you have to take into consideration that a lot of low-income families here in the United States, and we're talking about public schools primarily when we're talking about school closures and school openings, a lot of low-income families, you know, these children, their main, you know, source of education not only comes from the school, but a lot of their meals come from schools as well. You know, they get a decent meal from these school programs. So going to school when, for example, Eric Adams, our new mayor, says that the school is the safest place for children, it really doesn't just mean the educational factor of it. It means that these, you know, individuals, like I said, when it comes to low-income families, for example, you know, their meals come from the school. A hot meal, for example, that one hot meal that they get from the school. They get the emotional support from the school, and then, you know, they get the educational factor as well. So a lot of it goes into that. Parents, again, very mixed on whether or not children should go back to school or not. And I think one aspect of the fact that the FDA decided to really get these booster shots approved for children ages 12 and older was for children to be able to go back to school. But, you know, we'll have to wait and see how New York moves forward. But I think the state, at least, is very adamant for schools to stay open. But as you mentioned, teachers, you know, it's another story whether or not they feel safe coming back to school.
And Susan, you and I are both old enough to remember the year 2021, and particularly the last COVID-19 briefing of 2021 that came from the White House COVID-19 response team. Its coordinator, Jeff Zients, insisted at that briefing that the United States has the tools at its disposal to keep schools and businesses open. There was, he said, no question of a shutdown of the American economy. But in fact, we are seeing businesses poleaxed by COVID-19 now. Thousands of flights cancelled over the Christmas and New Year period. All sorts of other industries worried about the impacts of COVID-19 on staffing. What's the fallout of all of this going to be for the Biden administration?
You know, this was an administration that really ran on combating COVID, and it really, you know, it signifies the ability that human beings really have in combating a virus like this. You know, they really came in hot, criticizing the previous administration and not going after this virus. And when they're in the same situation, it almost seems like they're doing worse than the Trump administration did, because they're constantly, for some reason, caught off guard in one situation after the other. First, it was the Delta variant. Then they were caught off guard with the Omicron variant, and then with the testing that we're seeing right now. You know, while we do have more resources in our hands, but I think Americans are really struggling, first of all, to understand what CDC guidelines are, how to move forward. The messaging has been an absolute catastrophe. And then on the other hand, they can't really get their hands on proper testing to figure out whether or not they actually have the virus. And then when they do figure out, they don't know what exactly to do. So the fallout is going to be severe because this administration really ran on a COVID-centric message. You know, COVID is central, but then with COVID comes the other problems, as you mentioned, the shutdown of the economy, the school systems, the mental health crisis, crime is related to it, so on and so forth. So yes, this administration is in trouble, and the fact that, again, it's always acting like it's being caught off guard does not help.
Grim days ahead, because we're not even at the peak of this wave yet, it would seem. Susan Tehrani live for us in New York. Try and stay warm there. Thanks very much for that.